I was just a 35-year-old intern fetching coffee when my arrogant brother-in-law fired me in front of the entire corporate lobby. As I packed my cardboard box, I saw security throwing out an old deaf man in a faded coat. I stopped them and greeted him in sign language. What nobody knew, not my brother-in-law and certainly not me, was that the CEO was watching from the balcony above, and that old man owned the very building we were standing in. Before I tell you how I turned my public humiliation into the ultimate corporate takeover, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family who thought they could walk all over you. The sound of the cardboard box hitting the imported Italian marble floor echoed like a gunshot across the cavernous atrium. "Pack your desk, Jada." My brother-in-law Garrett did not just whisper it. He projected his voice so every junior analyst, every security guard, and every passing executive on the ground floor of Sterling Corporation could hear him. He stood there in his custom-tailored suit, his pale face flushed with an ugly, self-righteous anger. As the vice president of operations, Garrett wielded his authority like a club, and today I was the designated target. "I stuck my neck out for you," Garrett sneered, kicking the empty box closer to my scuffed loafers. "Jasmine begged me. She literally cried in our kitchen, pleading with me to find some little data entry corner for her pathetic older sister. She said you threw your whole life away playing nurse to your grandfather, that you had no resume, no prospects, no future. I gave you, a 35-year-old woman, a chance to be an intern Jada. And you cannot even manage a simple VIP guest list for the most important merger in this company's history." The heat crept up my neck, but I kept my face entirely still. I had learned a long time ago that showing emotion to my family only gave them ammunition. My parents, Calvin and Renee, had made that abundantly clear growing up in Atlanta. My younger sister Jasmine was their crowning achievement, the beautiful, ambitious daughter who secured her place in the upper echelon of society by marrying a wealthy, rising corporate star like Garrett. I was the cautionary tale. When our grandfather got sick with dementia, Calvin and Renee suddenly found themselves too busy with their charity galas to help. Jasmine was too busy planning her lavish destination wedding. So I stepped up. I paused my career, drained my meager savings, and spent my late 20s and early 30s managing medications and doctor's appointments. When he passed away last year, I was left with a massive gap in my resume and a family who looked at me like an embarrassing stain on their pristine social fabric. "You left 2 executive partners off the security clearance registry," Garrett barked, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Do you understand what that means? They were detained at the front desk for 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Jada. You made me look like an incompetent fool in front of the acquisition team." I knew for a fact I had submitted the correct list. I had double-checked it, sent it to his assistant, and received a confirmation email. But pointing that out now would be useless. Garrett needed a scapegoat for his own department's logistical failures, and as his wife's burdensome African-American sister, I was the perfect disposable target. "I submitted the approved list yesterday afternoon," I said quietly, keeping my voice even so as not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Garrett laughed, a harsh, grating sound that drew even more eyes toward us. "You are calling me a liar in front of my own staff? Pack your trash into that box and get out of my building. You are a liability to this company and a humiliation to my wife." The young interns I had been working alongside, kids fresh out of college, who were a full decade younger than me, watched with wide eyes. Some looked pitying, others amused. I knelt down on the cold marble, my knees popping slightly, and began placing my few desk items into the box. A framed photo of my grandfather. A worn notebook filled with data analytics coding I had been teaching myself late at night. A cheap ceramic coffee mug. "Security will escort you out," Garrett announced, checking his luxury watch as if my very presence was costing him thousands of dollars a second. "And do not bother calling Jasmine to cry about this. She already knows. We agreed you are simply not cut out for the corporate world. Maybe try retail." I focused on the methodical act of packing. The humiliation was a heavy, suffocating blanket pressing down on my chest, but I refused to let him see me break. I had survived watching the man who raised me slowly forget my name. I could survive being publicly fired by a man whose biggest hardship in life was a delayed tea time at his country club. I stood up, holding the cardboard box against my chest. The lobby was a massive, echoing monument to corporate power that had just chewed me up and spat me out. I turned toward the revolving glass doors, preparing for the long, shameful walk to the train station. But before I could take a single step toward the exit, a loud commotion erupted near the front entrance. The sharp, aggressive voices of the lobby security guards sliced through the ambient hum of the atrium. "Sir, you cannot be in here. You need to leave the premises immediately." I stopped and turned my head. Two burly security guards in dark suits were physically blocking an elderly African-American man from stepping further into the lobby. He looked entirely out of place in this temple of high finance. He was wearing a faded, slightly oversized trench coat, a flat cap pulled low over his gray hair, and scuffed brown shoes. He was gesturing frantically with his hands, his face contorted in a mix of frustration and desperate panic. "Read the sign, old man," one of the guards sneered, placing a heavy hand on the man's shoulder to shove him backward. "This is a private corporate building. No soliciting, no loitering. The public shelter is 3 blocks down." The elderly man shook his head violently, pointing toward the bank of executive elevators and signing something rapidly with his hands. His mouth opened, letting out a sharp, guttural sound of distress, but no actual words came out. Garrett, who had been watching the scene unfold from a few feet away, let out an exasperated groan. "Are you kidding me? Today of all days, get that vagrant out of my lobby right now before the acquisition board comes downstairs." The security guards escalated their force, grabbing the old man by both arms to physically drag him toward the revolving doors. The man's eyes widened in genuine terror. He dropped a worn leather satchel he had been holding, the contents spilling onto the floor, just as my own belongings had moments ago. Something inside me snapped. I knew that look of helpless panic. I had seen it in my grandfather's eyes 100 times when the world around him became too loud, too confusing, too dismissive of his humanity. I dropped my cardboard box back onto the marble floor. I did not care that I had just been fired. I did not care that my brother-in-law was glaring at me with unmasked contempt. I walked straight past Garrett and marched directly into the center of the altercation. I stepped right between the two towering security guards and the elderly man. My sudden movement caught them entirely off guard. I used that brief moment of confusion to gently place my hand on the first guard's thick wrist, physically pushing it away from the old man's frail shoulder. The guard stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock that a mere intern had just dared to intervene. Garrett completely lost his mind. He marched over his expensive leather shoes, clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He screamed that I was out of my mind, that the executive partners from the acquisition firm were arriving in exactly 20 minutes, and this lobby needed to be absolutely flawless. He commanded the guards to grab both of us and throw us out onto the rainy street like common trash. He threatened to call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. He threatened to make sure I never worked in this city again, promising to ruin my life so thoroughly that I would be begging for change on a street corner. I tuned out his shrill, privileged voice. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my breathing steady. I looked closely at the old man. His trench coat was worn and faded, yes, but the fabric was clean and well cared for. His brown shoes were scuffed but meticulously polished. And his hands, those frantic, trembling hands that the security guards had perceived as a threat, they were not moving in random or chaotic gestures. They were shaping distinct, deliberate forms. He was trying to communicate. I recognized the desperate sweeping motion of his fingers, the way his hands tried to articulate the words his voice could not. I looked closer at his ear and saw the small plastic casing of a hearing aid tucked behind the lobe. The battery compartment was slightly ajar, completely dead. He was not ignoring the guards' commands to leave. He literally could not hear them, and his desperate attempts to explain his situation were being treated as acts of violent aggression. My heart ached with a profound, heavy sorrow. I saw my late grandfather in those panicked, searching eyes. I remembered the crushing isolation my grandfather felt when his own body began to fail him, how the world just moved on, impatient and cruel, treating him like a nuisance instead of a human being who deserved basic respect. I remembered the countless doctor visits where nurses would speak over him, ignoring his presence entirely. I was not about to let that happen to someone else. Not today, not even if it cost me everything. I took a step closer to the man, making sure I was directly in his line of sight so he could read my lips and see my expressions. I raised my hands, keeping my movements smooth, clear, and unhurried. I drew upon the American Sign Language I had spent years mastering just so I could speak with my grandfather during his final days. I signed a warm greeting. "Hello, my name is Jada. You are safe now. How can I help you?" The entire lobby around us seemed to freeze in place. The security guards blinked, completely unsure of what to do now that the crazy lady from the data analytics department was throwing hand signals. Garrett was practically vibrating with rage behind me. He shouted that I was putting on a pathetic, dramatic show to try and save my miserable job. He called me a ghetto embarrassment who was dragging his pristine reputation through the mud. He told me that he would personally call every hiring manager in Atlanta to blacklist me from every corporate firm in the state. He wanted to make sure I understood that my life was over. I did not even turn my head to acknowledge his existence. My entire focus remained anchored on the elderly man standing in front of me. I wanted to create a bubble of safety for him in the middle of this hostile corporate war zone. The old man stopped moving his hands. His chest heaved as he let out a long, ragged breath. The sheer terror that had contorted his face slowly melted away, replaced by a look of profound, overwhelming relief. Somebody finally understood him. Somebody finally saw him as a person. He looked at my hands, then moved his gaze up to my eyes, studying me with an intensity that made me stand a little straighter. His eyes were a deep, piercing brown, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw something incredibly sharp hidden behind the exhaustion. I signed to him again, asking if he was hurt, asking if he needed me to call a family member or a friend for him. I told him not to worry about the loud, angry men in the suits, assuring him that I would stay right here by his side until he got exactly what he needed. I poured all the patience, empathy, and warmth I had cultivated during those long, lonely years, caring for my family, into my gestures. I needed this man to know that in this cold, heartless monument to corporate greed, he had an ally who would not back down. Behind me, Garrett was losing whatever shred of professional composure he had left. He lunged forward and grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging painfully through the fabric of my blouse. He yanked me backward, hissing that I was a worthless nobody who was intentionally sabotaging the biggest day of his entire career because I was jealous of my sister. He told me to get my filthy hands off the vagrant and get out of his sight. I ripped my shoulder out of his grasp with a sudden violent force that made him stumble back a step in shock. I turned around, looking my brother-in-law dead in the eye, and told him that if he ever touched me again, I would press assault charges right here in his precious, pristine lobby and let the acquisition board watch him get hauled away in handcuffs. I told him that he had already fired me, which meant he had absolutely zero authority over me anymore. I was a free citizen, and I was going to help this man whether he liked it or not. Garrett stood there, his mouth opening and closing his face, turning a mottled shade of red, as the remaining interns and staff watched him get put in his place by the woman he had just tried to destroy. I turned my back on him once more, facing the elderly man. I gave him a warm, reassuring smile, asking him one last time how I could assist him today. I expected him to ask for directions to the train station or perhaps the nearest bus stop. I expected him to sign that he was lost and just needed a way back home. Instead, the frail, panicked demeanor he had been projecting just moments ago simply vanished. It was as if a heavy mask had instantly fallen away. His posture straightened his stooped shoulders, pulling back with a sudden, undeniable authority that commanded the space around him. The frantic energy in his eyes was entirely replaced by a sharp, calculating gleam that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. He raised his hands, his gestures no longer frantic or fearful, but precise, commanding, and deliberate. He smiled sharply, looking right past me to where Garrett was fuming, and then he signed back to me. I stared at his hands, letting the heavy weight of his request sink in. The top floor was the executive suite, a fortress of glass and mahogany strictly reserved for the highest-ranking officers and billionaire clients. An intern like me had absolutely no business stepping foot up there, let alone bringing an unvetted, shabbily dressed stranger with me. But there was something about the steady, unyielding gaze of this elderly man that anchored me. He did not look like someone who was lost anymore. He looked like someone who owned the ground he stood on. I gave him a single firm nod. I signed back that I would take him right now. I placed my hand gently on the small of his back and guided him away from the stunned security guards. We started walking toward the polished steel turnstiles that separated the public lobby from the private executive elevators. That was when Garrett finally snapped out of his shock. I heard the frantic, heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes charging up behind me. He did not just shout this time. He lunged. Garrett grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my flesh with a bruising, desperate grip. He yanked me backwards so hard I nearly lost my balance, forcing me to spin around and face him. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour scent of his nervous sweat was suffocating. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute fury. "You are not just fired, Jada," he hissed, his voice trembling with a venom that chilled the air around us. "I am going to destroy you. I will personally call every single hiring manager, every recruiter, every firm in this entire state. You will never work in data analytics. You will never work in a corporate office again. I will make sure you are blacklisted so thoroughly that you will be scrubbing toilets for minimum wage by the end of the month. You are ruining the most important day of my life, and I will ruin yours." For a fraction of a second, the old conditioned fear tried to creep into my chest. This was my sister's husband. This was a man with real power, real wealth, and the full backing of my own parents. He had the resources to follow through on every single one of those threats. A year ago, I would have shrunk back. I would have apologized, lowered my head, and begged for my meager internship back just to keep the family peace. But standing there feeling the sharp sting of his fingers bruising my arm, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy clarity. I thought about the years I spent watching my grandfather fade away while Garrett and my sister Jasmine clinked champagne glasses at country club galas. I thought about the endless nights I spent crying from exhaustion, entirely abandoned by the people who were supposed to be my blood. They had already taken my youth, my peace of mind, and my family. I ripped my arm out of his grasp with a violent, forceful jerk. I stepped right into his personal space, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. "I have nothing left for you to ruin, Garrett," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous calm. "You and my parents already took everything that mattered to me. You cannot threaten a woman who has already survived the worst you have to offer. Now back off, or I will scream for the police and tell them the vice president of operations just assaulted me in front of 30 witnesses." Garrett froze. The color drained completely from his face. He looked around suddenly, hyper-aware of the dozens of employees and guards staring at us with open mouths. He took a slow, shaky step back, rubbing his jaw as if I had physically slapped him. I did not wait for his rebuttal. I turned my back on him, walked up to the secure turnstile, and pulled out my standard-issue intern badge. I tapped it against the scanner. A sharp beep echoed, and the little green light flashed approvingly. The glass barriers slid open. I gestured for the elderly man to step through, and I followed right behind him, leaving Garrett sputtering and defeated on the other side of the glass. We walked in silence toward the bank of private executive elevators. The old man walked with a slow, deliberate grace, completely unbothered by the absolute chaos we had just left in our wake. I pressed the up button. The heavy polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime. We stepped inside the spacious mirrored cabin. I reached out and pressed the button for the 50th floor, the executive boardroom level. As the elevator doors began their slow, silent glide shut, I turned around to look out into the massive corporate atrium one last time. My eyes swept over the marble floors past the bewildered security guards, past Garrett, who was furiously dialing his phone, likely calling my sister to complain about my insubordination. But my gaze did not stop there. It drifted upward, drawn by an inexplicable heavy intuition. I looked up through the towering glass atrium, past the sweeping architectural curves of the building, straight to the second-floor mezzanine. The mezzanine was a suspended glass walkway reserved exclusively for senior management. And standing right at the edge of the glass railing, looking directly down at me, was Valerie. Valerie was the chief executive officer of Sterling Corporation. She was a striking, formidable African-American woman who had shattered every glass ceiling in the industry. She was known to be brilliantly ruthless, a woman who fired vice presidents without blinking and orchestrated billion-dollar acquisitions before her morning coffee. She wore a flawless, tailored emerald green suit, her posture radiating absolute untouchable authority. I froze. The breath hitched in my throat. I expected to see outrage on her face. I expected her to be reaching for her phone to call security and have the elevator halted, but she was not moving. Her hands were resting casually on the glass railing. Her expression was completely unreadable, a perfectly smooth mask of corporate detachment. But her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing, were locked directly onto mine. She had watched the entire altercation. She had seen Garrett scream at me. She had seen me physically rip my arm away from him. She had seen me guide the deaf elderly man through the turnstiles in direct defiance of a vice president. She did not look angry. She looked intrigued. It was a piercing, heavy stare that seemed to strip away all the noise and chaos of the lobby, pinning me in place. The heavy steel doors of the elevator finally slid together, sealing shut with a definitive click. The connection was broken, but the weight of her stare lingered on my skin like a physical pressure. The elevator lurched slightly, beginning its rapid, silent ascent toward the top of the skyline. I stood next to the elderly man, my hands trembling slightly, as the floor numbers ticked higher and higher. I had just blown up my entire life. I had publicly humiliated the man who controlled my family dynamic. I was riding a restricted elevator to a floor I was forbidden from entering, accompanying a man I did not even know. And the most powerful woman in the city had just watched me do it. I had no idea what was waiting for me at the top, but there was no turning back now. The elevator ride felt like floating in a vacuum. The old man beside me stood perfectly still, his posture radiating a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with his faded trench coat. When the heavy steel doors finally parted on the 50th floor, the atmosphere shifted entirely. It was a realm of hushed, intimidating wealth. Thick mahogany paneling lined the walls and the plush carpet absorbed every sound of our footsteps. Behind a massive curved desk sat an executive assistant who looked up with immediate alarm, her eyes darting from my low-level intern badge to the unkempt man standing beside me. I did not give her a chance to call security or ask any questions. I gently guided the elderly man to the edge of her desk, offered him a final respectful nod, and turned back to the elevator. My job here was done. I had protected a vulnerable person, and in doing so, I had sealed my own fate. I did not ask for a reward or wait for an explanation. I stepped back into the elevator and pressed the down button. The descent back to the data analytics floor felt twice as fast. When the doors opened, the frantic energy of the bullpen hit me like a physical wave. The moment I stepped onto the floor, the typing stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the open plan office. Everyone already knew. Word traveled fast in Sterling Corporation, especially when a senior vice president threw a public tantrum in the main lobby. I kept my chin up and walked straight to my tiny, cramped cubicle. The other interns, brilliant 20-something kids who had spent the last 3 months treating me like a fascinating fossil, did not try to hide their stares. I could hear the harsh whispers drifting over the low partition walls. They were probably wondering how someone my age could fail so spectacularly at a basic entry-level job. I ignored the sting of their judgment. I picked up my cardboard box and finished packing the few remaining pieces of my life. I packed my spare sweater, a handful of pens, and the detailed coding manuals I had been studying until my eyes burned every night. The hardest thing to pack was a small framed photo of my grandfather. Looking at his gentle, smiling face reminded me exactly why I was 10 years behind my peers, and exactly why I did not regret intervening downstairs. I placed his picture safely at the bottom of the box. I carried my heavy burden back to the elevator and rode down to the main lobby. The space was still buzzing with corporate anxiety executives and staff rushing to prepare for the merger meeting. The security guards who had manhandled the old man avoided my gaze entirely, looking down at their radios as I passed. Garrett was nowhere to be seen. He was likely sequestered in his corner glass office, already crafting his twisted version of events to human resources. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the harsh Atlanta weather. The sky had cracked open, unleashing a torrential downpour that washed over the concrete sidewalks. I had no umbrella, and the discount parking garage where I could afford to leave my car was 4 blocks away. I tucked my chin down, hugged the cardboard box tightly against my chest to protect my grandfather photo from the wet, and started walking. The cold rain soaked through my thin blouse within seconds, chilling me to the bone. Each step felt heavier than the last. The physical weight of the box mirrored the crushing emotional exhaustion settling over my shoulders. By the time I reached the parking lot, my shoes were completely waterlogged. I found my rusted 10-year-old sedan wedged between 2 sleek luxury SUVs. It was a painful, glaring reminder of exactly where I stood in the world. I unlocked the door, threw the damp box into the passenger seat, and climbed behind the wheel. I slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet, cold interior of my car. I sat there, shivering, water dripping from my hair and sliding down my face, blurring my vision. Before I could even put the keys in the ignition, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out, wiping the wet screen with my thumb. A text message notification glared back at me. It was from my mother, Renee. I opened the message, bracing myself. I knew what to expect, but the sheer cruelty of the words still managed to knock the wind out of me. Garrett just called. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Dinner at our house at 7 p.m. You will fix this. I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. There was not a single question about whether I was okay. Not a single inquiry about what actually happened in the lobby or why I had clashed with my brother-in-law. Renee had not asked for my side of the story because my side did not matter to her. It never had. Garrett had immediately run to my parents, weaponizing their obsession with social status to control the narrative before I even made it to my car. They took his side instantly, eagerly sacrificing their own daughter to protect the fragile ego of the man who funded their lavish lifestyle. Jasmine had married a vice president, elevating our family name, and in my parents' eyes that made Garrett bulletproof. My entire life had been a series of silent sacrifices. I had given up my youth, my peace, and my career to care for the grandfather they had abandoned. I had swallowed my pride to accept a degrading internship just to get back on my feet. And this was my reward, being discarded, being called an embarrassment. A deep, unfamiliar heat began to build in my chest, melting away the freezing chill of the rain. It was not the familiar heavy weight of depression or the stinging ache of rejection. It was pure, unadulterated anger. I looked at my pale, exhausted reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me had spent 35 years being the family scapegoat, quietly absorbing their toxicity, just to keep the peace. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel, my damp hands squeezing until my knuckles turned completely ashen. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger settle into a cold, hardened resolve. The era of being their punching bag was officially over. If they wanted me at dinner tonight to fix this, I would gladly show up. But I would not be the one doing the apologizing. I drove through the torrential Atlanta rain, the rhythmic squeak of my worn windshield wipers acting as a metronome for my racing thoughts. The drive to my parents' affluent suburban neighborhood took 45 minutes each mile, dragging me further away from the gritty reality of my life and deeper into the polished, superficial world they worshipped. Calvin and Renee lived in a massive, sprawling brick estate tucked behind wrought iron gates. It was a house completely financed by the exorbitant corporate bonuses Garrett pulled in every quarter. My parents loved to show it off, hosting extravagant dinner parties and pretending they had accumulated this wealth through their own hard work. The truth was, they had simply sold their golden child, my younger sister Jasmine, to the highest bidder, and they happily lived off the spoils. I parked my rusted sedan at the very end of their long, sweeping driveway, intentionally keeping it far away from the sleek, luxury vehicles parked near the entrance. I stepped out into the freezing downpour. I did not have a jacket, and my clothes were still damp from my exit at Sterling Corporation. By the time I reached the massive mahogany front doors, I was shivering violently. I did not bother knocking. I turned the heavy brass handle and let myself in. The moment I crossed the threshold, the suffocating atmosphere of the house hit me like a physical wall. The air smelled of expensive citrus candles and roasted lamb, a sharp contrast to the cold, metallic scent of the rain clinging to my skin. I stood in the grand foyer, water dripping from my soaked blouse onto the pristine imported Persian rug. Neither of my parents moved to offer me a towel. They did not offer me a seat. They did not even ask if I was okay. Calvin and Renee stood side by side in the sunken living room, their arms crossed, looking at me with expressions of absolute unadulterated disgust. It was the same look they used to give stray animals that wandered too close to their manicured lawn. "Look at you," Renee spat, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice dripped with a venom so pure it practically burned the air between us. "You look like a drowning rat. You are 35 years old, Jada. 35. And you still managed to drag the mud of your miserable failures into my clean house. You could not just be grateful. You could not just keep your head down and do the pathetic little data entry job your sister graciously begged her husband to give you. No. You had to cause a public spectacle." I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest to suppress a shiver. "I did not cause a spectacle, Mother," I said, keeping my voice remarkably level. A deaf elderly man was being assaulted by corporate security. He needed help. I stepped in because your precious son-in-law was too busy throwing a temper tantrum over his lobby aesthetics to treat a human being with basic dignity. "Do not you dare speak about Garrett that way," Calvin bellowed, taking a menacing step forward. His face turned a dangerous deep shade of crimson. "Garrett is a vice president. He is a provider. He is the reason we have this roof over our heads, and the reason your sister lives like a queen. He was hosting the most critical merger acquisition in Sterling Corporation history today, and you humiliated him. You humiliated our family name. For what? For some homeless beggar who wandered off the street. You jeopardized millions of dollars because you wanted to play savior." Renee stepped up beside my father, her eyes flashing with a cold, calculating cruelty. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in a sneer. "You have always been so desperate to feel important, Jada. You wasted the best years of your life wiping spit off your grandfather's chin, pretending you were some kind of saint, while Jasmine went out and built an empire. Jasmine secured a powerful husband. Jasmine brought prestige to this family. And what do you have? Nothing. You are a middle-aged single, entry-level failure. And instead of thanking Garrett for throwing you a lifeline, you bit the hand that feeds us all." The audacity of her words felt like a physical blow, but I refused to let it show. "You abandoned your own father when his mind started failing." I shot back, my voice gaining volume and strength. "You and Calvin put him in a cheap state facility and never looked back. I sacrificed my career and my 20s to give him the dignity you denied him. If that makes me a failure in your eyes, then I wear that title with absolute pride. And as for Garrett, he did not throw me a lifeline. He gave me an internship so he could hold it over my head and remind me of my place. I will never apologize for doing the right thing." Renee let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, you will apologize," she hissed, stepping so close I could smell the sharp mint of her breath. "You are going to march back into that corporate office tomorrow morning. You are going to find Garrett. You are going to drop to your actual knees, and you are going to beg for his forgiveness. You will tell him that you were hysterical, that you were wrong, and that you will do whatever it takes to make amends." I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling the last remaining thread of familial obligation snap and dissolve into dust. I am not apologizing to a man who treats vulnerable people like garbage, I said softly. And I am certainly not getting on my knees for him or for you. Calvin slammed his fist against the hallway console table, rattling the expensive porcelain vases. You ungrateful, arrogant liability. If you do not fix this right now, you are no longer a part of this family. I will completely disown you. We will cut you off, erase your name from our lives, and make sure you do not get a single dime when we pass. You will be dead to us, Jada. Do you hear me? Dead to us. I looked at my father, taking in his furious red face and his trembling fists. I looked at my mother, whose eyes held nothing but icy contempt. For 35 years, I had craved their love. I had bent over backward, played the dutiful daughter, sacrificed my own happiness, all in the desperate hope that one day they would look at me the way they looked at Jasmine. But standing in their beautiful, sterile foyer, completely soaked in rain, I finally realized the truth. They did not have the capacity to love me. They only loved what people could do for their social standing. Disown me then, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, unshakable authority that echoed through the grand entryway. Keep your money. Keep your prestige. Keep your toxic, miserable lives. I would rather be broke and alone than spend another second pretending this family is anything but a nightmare. The heavy sliding mahogany doors leading to the formal dining room suddenly pushed open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels against hardwood pierced the heavy silence. I turned my head. My younger sister Jasmine stepped out of the shadows of the dining room, radiating a smug, venomous triumph. She was dressed in flawless, expensive silk, her hair perfectly styled, dripping in the diamonds her husband had bought her. Right behind her walked Garrett. He had changed out of his work suit and was now wearing a casual cashmere sweater, looking entirely too comfortable in my parents' home. He wore a predatory, satisfied grin that made my stomach churn. But it was not his arrogant smile that caught my attention. It was what Jasmine was holding in her manicured hands. She was clutching a thick gray legal folder, clutching it tightly against her chest, like a weapon she had been waiting her entire life to use against me. Jasmine stopped a few feet away from me. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the muddy water pooling around my scuffed thrift store loafers. She was wearing a pristine white silk blouse and tailored trousers that probably cost more than my car. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the light of the crystal chandelier overhead, sparkling with a cold, hard brilliance. It was a gift from Garrett, bought with the very corporate bonuses they were now using to hold my parents hostage. You really are a disaster, Jada, Jasmine said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. I begged Garrett to give you that internship. I literally cried tears for you. I told him you were trying to get your life together after Grandpa died. And this is how you repay us. You show up at his office and act like some ghetto vigilante, screaming at security guards and hugging homeless people in front of billionaire investors. I stared at my younger sister. I remembered changing her diapers. I remembered working double shifts at a diner just to buy her a prom dress when our parents said they could not afford it. She had completely rewritten our history to fit her new reality. In her mind, she was the benevolent queen, and I was the pathetic peasant who could not behave. He was not homeless, I said, my voice steady despite the freezing wet clothes clinging to my skin. He was a deaf man whose hearing aid had died. He was terrified. Your husband ordered security to throw him onto the street like garbage. He was a liability, Garrett interrupted, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Jasmine. He crossed his arms, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. My lobby is not a charity clinic. Today was the most critical day of my career. The Sterling Corporation merger is worth billions. I am 2 weeks away from being named Senior Vice President of Operations. That promotion guarantees this family generational wealth. And you decided to jeopardize all of it to play social worker. Garrett uncrossed his arms and picked up the thick gray legal folder Jasmine had brought out. He walked over to the marble console table in the entryway and tossed the folder down. The heavy slap of the paper echoed loudly against the high ceilings. He opened it, revealing a dense stack of legal documents flagged with bright yellow signature stickers. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and laid it precisely next to the pages. "This is a non-disclosure agreement," Garrett announced, his tone shifting into the smooth, clinical cadence he used in boardrooms. "But it also serves as a formal termination acknowledgement. By signing this, you agree that you were fired today for gross negligence, erratic workplace behavior, and a direct violation of corporate security protocols. You admit that you compromised the safety of the executive lobby." I looked at the documents, then back at him. My mind struggled to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand. "You want me to sign a legal confession stating that I was the aggressor," I said. "You want me to put on record that I was a threat, just so human resources will not question why a vice president was screaming and assaulting an intern in public." "I am protecting the company narrative," Garrett corrected smoothly. "And I am protecting my promotion. You are going to sign it, and in exchange, I will not press criminal trespassing charges against you. I will simply let you fade back into whatever miserable existence you crawled out of." My mother stepped forward, her face twisted with desperate urgency. "Pick up the pen, Jada. Do it right now. Garrett is being more than generous. He could have you thrown in jail for what you did today. You are a 35-year-old woman with nothing to your name. You cannot afford a legal battle against Sterling Corporation." "He assaulted me," I said, looking directly at my mother, hoping to find a single shred of maternal instinct left in her soul. "He grabbed my arm so hard it bruised. He tried to drag me across the floor." "Are you seriously asking me to sign a paper that says I was the one out of line?" "You provoked him." "My father," Calvin bellowed from the living room step. "You refused a direct order from a superior. You have always been stubborn and difficult. Jasmine is trying to build an empire with her husband, and you are acting like an anchor dragging them down. Sign the document. Swallow your ridiculous pride for once in your life and do what is best for this family." The walls of the grand foyer felt like they were closing in on me. The smell of expensive roasted lamb from the dining room was making me nauseous. 4 people stood around me, entirely united in their delusion. They had built a toxic ecosystem where Garrett could do no wrong because his paycheck funded their vanity. They needed me to be the villain so they could continue playing the victims. They needed my signature to wash away their own moral bankruptcy. I looked at the silver pen resting on the marble table. I thought about the power they held. I thought about the grueling months I had spent sending out hundreds of resumes, desperate for a chance to restart my career after my grandfather passed. I knew Garrett was not making empty threats. He had the corporate connections to make sure my name was flagged in every background check in the state. He could easily ensure I never worked in data analytics again. He could force me back to working minimum wage retail jobs just to survive. But as I stared at the yellow signature tabs, I realized something incredibly liberating. They were terrified. If Garrett was truly untouchable, he would not need my signature to save his job. He needed this document because he knew his public meltdown was a massive liability. He needed me to take the fall so he could secure his precious promotion. For the first time in my life, I held a tiny fraction of power over him, simply by refusing to comply. I took a step back from the marble console table, putting distance between myself and the pen. I kept my hands firmly at my sides. "I will not sign a lie." I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "I will not legally absolve you of your own cruelty just to make your corporate climb a little easier. You want to tell human resources I am a security threat. Go ahead. Let them review the lobby camera footage and see exactly who the aggressor was." Garrett's face darkened. The smug, untouchable facade cracked, revealing the panicked, vicious bully hiding underneath. He took a step toward me, but Jasmine reached out and placed a manicured hand on his chest to stop him. She stepped in front of her husband, closing the distance between us, until I could smell her expensive floral perfume over the damp scent of my own rain-soaked clothes. Jasmine tilted her head, her beautiful face twisting into a mask of pure, calculated malice. She looked at me, not as a sister but as an insect she was preparing to crush under her designer heel. Jasmine smiled sweetly and added, "Sign it, Jada, or Garrett will make sure you cannot even get a job flipping burgers in this city." I stood in the center of my parents' grand foyer and looked at the four faces surrounding me. I looked at Jasmine, my baby sister, whose eyes held absolutely zero remorse. She was entirely consumed by the preservation of her own wealth, perfectly willing to throw me to the wolves if it meant keeping her designer lifestyle intact. I looked at my mother Renee, who was nodding in agreement with Jasmine. Cruel ultimatum, her face tight with impatience. And I looked at my father, Calvin, a man who had once taught me how to ride a bike, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the arrogant white man who had just assaulted me in a corporate lobby. They did not see a daughter. They did not see a sister. They saw a barrier between them and their next luxury vacation. They valued Garrett white-collar status, his vice president title, and his massive corporate bonuses far more than they valued my dignity, my career, or my basic humanity. For 35 years, I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough, if I was responsible and dutiful, they would eventually love me. I had paused my entire life to care for my grandfather when they refused to lift a finger, silently hoping my devotion would earn their respect. But in this cold, beautifully decorated house, the truth finally shattered that lifelong illusion. Their love was a transaction, and I had simply run out of currency. The suffocating weight of my lifelong desperation evaporated. The anxiety that had been clutching my chest since Garrett screamed at me in the lobby completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, razor-sharp clarity. I did not feel scared anymore. I did not feel small. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen Garrett had placed on the console table. For a fraction of a second, relief washed over my mother's face. Jasmine smirked, clearly believing she had won, assuming I was broken and ready to submit to their demands. Garrett crossed his arms, his chest puffing out with arrogant triumph. I did not uncap the pen. Instead, I tossed it casually over my shoulder. It hit the imported tile floor with a sharp, dismissive clatter that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Before any of them could process what I was doing, I picked up the thick gray legal folder containing the non-disclosure agreement. I gripped the dense stack of papers firmly in both hands. I locked eyes with Garrett, maintaining a dead, unwavering stare. Then, with every ounce of strength I had left in my exhausted, rain-soaked body, I twisted my wrists and tore the document right down the middle. The sound of the thick paper ripping violently apart was the loudest thing in the room. Jasmine gasped, taking a sudden step backward, as if I had just thrown a punch. Renee let out a high, shocked noise, her hand flying to her mouth. I took the two torn halves of Garrett's precious legal shield and dropped them carelessly onto the polished granite surface of the table. "I am not your scapegoat anymore," I said, my voice ringing out with a calm, terrifying certainty. "I will not sign away my truth to protect a weak, insecure man who throws temper tantrums when he loses control. You can try to blacklist me. You can try to ruin my career. But you will never own me again." The absolute silence that followed my words lasted only a second before the room erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. Garrett's face twisted into a mask of pure rage, his hands curling into tight fists. But it was my father who reacted with the most explosive fury. Calvin stormed forward, his face purple, a vein pulsing dangerously in his neck. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You arrogant, ungrateful wretch!" Calvin roared, his voice shaking the crystal pendants on the chandelier above us. "How dare you disrespect this family? How dare you disrespect the man who puts food on your sister table? I gave you life, and this is how you repay us, by trying to drag us all down into the gutter with you." I looked at my father, feeling absolutely nothing but pity for the small, greedy man he had become. "You did not give me a life," I replied quietly. "You gave me a script, and I am officially done reading my lines." Calvin lunged forward, stopping just inches from me. "Then you are nothing to us," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You hear me, Jada? You are not my daughter. You are not a part of this family. I am disowning you right here, right now. Do not you ever call us. Do not you ever show your face at this house again. If you die in the streets, do not expect us to claim your body. Get out of my house." Renee stood behind him, her arms crossed tight, nodding her head in vigorous agreement. "Go," she hissed coldly. "You have always been a disappointment. Now you are just a liability." I looked at the four of them one last time, committing this moment to memory. This was the defining closure I had needed for over a decade. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal or defense. I simply turned my back on the people who shared my blood and walked toward the heavy mahogany front doors. I grasped the brass handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the freezing, torrential Atlanta downpour. I did not look back. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me, the loud, definitive thud severing my ties to that house forever. The rain was coming down in sheets, instantly soaking through the damp fabric of my clothes, but I barely felt the cold. As I walked down the long, winding driveway away from their pristine mansion, a strange, overwhelming sense of liberation washed over me. I had absolutely nothing. No job, no money, no family, and no safety net. But for the very first time in 35 years, I was completely and entirely free. I reached the end of the driveway where my rusted 10-year-old sedan was parked. Puddles of muddy water splashed over my scuffed loafers as I unlocked the door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet, damp interior of my car. I leaned my head back against the headrest, taking a long, shaky breath, letting the adrenaline slowly drain from my system. I reached into my pocket to pull out my keys, but my fingers brushed against my phone. It was vibrating continuously, a steady, urgent rhythm against my thigh. I pulled the phone out, expecting a barrage of hateful text messages from Jasmine or more threats from Garrett. The screen lit up the dark, cold interior of my car with a bright blue glow. It was not a text message. It was a high-priority email notification. I wiped a drop of rain off the glass screen with my thumb and stared at the sender address. My breath caught in my throat. It was not from Human Resources. It was not from the legal department. The sender address read, Valerie CEO at sterlingcorp.com. My hands started to tremble as I tapped the notification to open the message. The email did not contain a termination notice. It did not contain legal threats. It consisted of a single highly urgent subject line, followed by a brief demanding sentence. Urgent. Report to Boardroom 1 at 8 a.m. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Boardroom 1 was the absolute highest level of the corporate fortress, a room reserved exclusively for the board of directors and the CEO herself. Valerie had watched me defy a vice president. She had watched me break every rule in the corporate handbook to protect an elderly deaf man in her lobby. And instead of letting Human Resources quietly terminate me, the most powerful woman in the city was summoning me directly to her table. I gripped the steering wheel, the cold leather grounding me. The war with my family was over, but a much bigger battle was about to begin. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark, watching the rain beat against my bedroom window, running through every possible worst-case scenario. Valerie was not the type of CEO who summoned entry-level interns to her private boardroom just to hand them a standard termination letter. Human Resources handled the bottom feeders. The top floor handled corporate espionage, multi-million-dollar lawsuits, and executive sabotage. Garrett had undoubtedly spun a massive lie. He probably told her I was a violent, unhinged threat to the merger. He wanted to crush me, and he was using the most powerful woman in Atlanta to do it. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale gray light over my small apartment, I got dressed. I put on my best thrift store blazer and polished my scuffed shoes. I had absolutely $0 in my bank account to fight a corporate legal team, but I had my dignity, and I was not going to let a woman in an expensive suit intimidate me into signing a false confession. I drove my rusted sedan back into the heart of the financial district. The towering glass facade of Sterling Corporation loomed against the cloudy sky, looking more like an impenetrable fortress than an office building. I parked and walked toward the main entrance, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I fully expected my intern badge to be deactivated. I expected to be met by police officers or served with a restraining order the moment I crossed the threshold. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling marble atrium. The morning rush was in full swing, executives and analysts buzzing around with their expensive coffees and leather briefcases. I walked straight toward the security desk. The two large security guards standing by the turnstiles were the exact same men who had tried to physically drag the deaf elderly man out of the building yesterday. The same men who had watched Garrett assault me. When they saw me approaching, their entire demeanor shifted. They did not sneer. They did not reach for their radios to call for backup. Instead, the color completely drained from their faces. They looked absolutely terrified. The taller guard literally stumbled over his own feet, rushing to get out from behind the desk. He did not ask for my identification. He did not ask what I was doing back in the building after being publicly fired by a vice president. He practically bowed as he approached me, his hands held up in a placating, nervous gesture. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We have been instructed to escort you directly to the private executive elevator. Please follow me." I hid my shock behind a smooth, expressionless mask. I did not say a word as he quickly ushered me past the standard employee turnstiles. The younger interns and junior staff who had mocked my walk of shame yesterday stopped in their tracks. They watched with wide, confused eyes as corporate security gave me the absolute highest level of VIP treatment. The guard led me to a hidden alcove off the main lobby, stopping in front of a sleek, unmarked set of elevator doors. This elevator required a biometric scan to operate. The guard pressed his thumb against the glowing sensor, and the heavy metal doors slid open instantly. "They are waiting for you on the top floor," he murmured, stepping back respectfully and keeping his eyes glued to the floor. I stepped into the spacious mirrored cabin alone. The doors closed, sealing out the noise of the lobby. The elevator shot upward with a smooth, silent velocity that made my stomach drop. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel walls. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my shoulders to relax. I told myself that no matter what Valerie threatened me with, I would not break. I would not apologize for treating a vulnerable human being with respect, even if it cost me my future. The elevator slowed, and with a soft chime the doors parted. I stepped out onto the 50th floor. The atmosphere up here was entirely different from the chaotic energy of the lower levels. It was a realm of profound quiet wealth. The air smelled of fresh espresso and expensive floor polish. Thick, dark mahogany lined the walls, and the plush carpet absorbed every sound. There were no busy assistants rushing down the halls. It was dead silent. I walked down the wide corridor, following the subtle brass plaques on the walls, until I reached a set of massive, towering double doors. A discreet sign read, "Boardroom 1." My hands were shaking. I balled them into tight fists, took one last steadying breath, and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The boardroom was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. In the center of the room sat a massive polished mahogany table surrounded by plush leather executive chairs. But it was not the room that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was the people sitting inside it. Sitting dead center at the head of the long table was Valerie. She wore a sharp charcoal gray pantsuit today, her posture radiating that same untouchable, commanding authority I had witnessed from the mezzanine. Her hands were folded neatly on the table, and she was watching me with those piercing, analytical eyes. She did not look angry. She looked intensely focused. But she was not alone. Sitting right next to her in the seat reserved for the highest-ranking officer in the room was the elderly man from the lobby. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the visual disconnect. He was no longer wearing the faded, oversized trench coat. He was no longer wearing the scuffed brown shoes or the flat cap pulled low over his eyes. Today, the old man was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored midnight blue suit that clearly cost more than I made in a year. A crisp white shirt framed his face, and a sleek platinum watch rested on his wrist. The frantic, terrified energy he had displayed while being shoved around by security was completely gone. He sat back in the heavy leather chair with an undeniable quiet power. He looked like a king sitting on his throne. He looked right at me, a warm, familiar recognition sparking in his deep brown eyes, and the corners of his mouth lifted into a small, knowing smile. I stood frozen in the doorway of the executive boardroom, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding in front of me. My mind scrambled to reconcile the image of the frantic, terrified man from the lobby with the composed, powerful figure currently sitting at the head of the mahogany table. The faded, oversized trench coat was gone. The scuffed brown shoes were gone. In their place was a man who radiated absolute authority, an untouchable calm that filled the massive room. He looked at me with those deep brown eyes and gave me a slow, deliberate nod of recognition. Valerie broke the heavy silence. She gestured toward the empty leather chair directly across from them and told me to sit down. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk forward and take the seat. I kept my back completely straight, bracing myself for whatever twisted corporate game was being played. Valerie steepled her fingers on the polished wood. She did not raise her voice, but it carried a sharp, undeniable weight. She told me that she believed introductions were in order. She turned her head slightly toward the elderly man and announced his name, Harrison Sterling. The air in my lungs vanished. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. Harrison Sterling was not just a name, he was a corporate legend. He was the billionaire founder and majority shareholder of Sterling Corporation. He had built this massive empire from the ground up decades ago, fighting tooth and nail in an industry that rarely opened its doors to African American men. He was known to be notoriously reclusive, a ghost who controlled the board of directors from the shadows, while letting executives like Valerie handle the public-facing operations. Nobody in the lower levels had ever actually seen him in person. Garrett and the other vice presidents treated him like a mythical figure, a deity they constantly tried to impress with their quarterly margins. And I had just guided him through a security turnstile with my plastic intern badge. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, or perhaps to defend my actions in the lobby. But before a single word could leave my throat, Harrison raised his hand. It was a gentle but commanding gesture. He looked directly into my eyes and began to move his hands. His signs were no longer the frantic, desperate gestures of a man trying to survive a hostile encounter. They were smooth, precise, and incredibly eloquent. He signed that I did not need to be afraid. He told me to take a deep breath because I was completely safe in this room. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion build in the back of my throat. I raised my own trembling hands and signed back to him. I told him it was an honor to properly meet him, and I asked him why he had been wearing a worn-out coat and letting my brother-in-law treat him like a trespasser. Harrison smiled softly, leaning forward in his high-backed leather chair. His hands moved with a practiced, steady rhythm as he explained the truth. He signed that corporate mergers bring out the absolute worst in people. When billions of dollars are on the line, executives forget the foundational values of the company. They forget that the empire was built on integrity and respect. Harrison told me he was tired of reading sanitized reports and listening to rehearsed presentations from arrogant vice presidents who only cared about their own bonuses. He wanted to see the real culture of his company. He wanted to see how the lowest-ranking employees and the highest-ranking officers treated a person who offered them absolutely no financial benefit. He called it a silent audit. For the past 3 days, he had been walking the floors of his own building, dressed as a confused, vulnerable outsider. Harrison's face hardened, his eyes flashing with a profound disappointment as he signed his next words. He told me that every single executive he encountered had ignored him. Some walked right past him while he pretended to be lost. Others ordered their assistants to call security. But nobody had disgusted him more than the vice president of operations. He signed Garrett's name with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. He told me that Garrett was a weak, insecure bully who thought power meant crushing those beneath him. Harrison had watched Garrett humiliate me in front of the entire lobby. He had watched Garrett order security to physically throw a disabled man onto the rainy street just to protect the aesthetics of a merger meeting. Then Harrison's expression softened entirely. He looked at me with a warmth that reminded me so fiercely of my late grandfather, it made my chest ache. He signed that in a building filled with thousands of ambitious, ruthless professionals, I was the only person who stopped to see his humanity. I was the only one who risked my career, my safety, and my pride to protect a stranger. He told me that compassion and integrity were the rarest currencies in the corporate world, and I had just proven I possessed both in abundance. I sat there completely overwhelmed, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over my eyelashes. For 35 years, my family had told me I was a failure because I prioritized caring for my grandfather over climbing the corporate ladder. They had mocked my empathy and weaponized my sacrifices. And yet here, in the highest room of the most powerful building in the city, that exact same empathy had just saved me. Harrison turned to Valerie and signed a brief, rapid directive. He did not look at me when he did it, keeping his focus entirely on the chief executive officer. Valerie nodded once, perfectly understanding his silent command. She folded her hands back together and fixed her piercing analytical gaze squarely on me. The intimidating corporate mask she wore shifted just a fraction, revealing a very real, very dangerous smile. She told me that Mr. Sterling did not bring me up to the 50th floor to fire me. She said he actually had a much bigger problem on his hands now that he knew exactly how rotten the operations department had become under current leadership. Valerie leaned across the heavy mahogany table and told me that Mr. Sterling did not want to terminate my internship. He wanted to give me Garrett's entire department. Give me his department! I repeated the words slowly, making sure I had heard the CEO correctly. My voice sounded hollow and small in the massive expanse of the executive boardroom. I looked from Valerie to Harrison, searching their faces for a punchline. This had to be some sort of test. I was a 35-year-old intern who had just been publicly terminated in the lobby. You do not just hand over a multi-million-dollar operations division to someone without a master's degree and a decade of corporate climbing. Valerie leaned back in her heavy leather chair, her emerald green suit catching the morning light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She did not smile. She looked at me with the calculating precision of a general moving pieces on a chessboard. Mr. Sterling is completely serious, Jada, she said smoothly. Valerie explained the reality of the situation with surgical bluntness. Sterling Corporation was weeks away from finalizing the largest merger in the company history. They were absorbing a massive international tech firm, a deal that required absolute undeniable financial transparency. But over the last 2 years, the operations department had become a toxic black box. Garrett had repeatedly stonewalled internal audits, using his upcoming promotion to senior vice president as a shield to block anyone from looking too closely at his vendor contracts and departmental spending. Harrison had grown highly suspicious of the bloated budgets and the vicious cutthroat culture Garrett was breeding on the lower floors. The founder needed a watchdog. He needed a director who was completely immune to the toxic social politics of the executive suite. He needed someone whose integrity could not be bought, intimidated, or bullied. Harrison raised his hands again. He signed that he had built this company on the foundation of treating people right, especially those who had nothing to offer in return. He had watched me sacrifice my own safety to protect a man I thought was a vulnerable stranger. He signed that anyone who possessed that kind of fierce, unwavering moral compass was exactly the kind of leader his company desperately needed right now. I have the data skills, I told them, my voice growing steadier as the initial shock began to wear off. I spent 5 years studying advanced cybersecurity protocols and financial data architecture every single night while my grandfather was asleep. I know how to track digital anomalies. I know how to hunt down hidden funds. But I do not have the executive pedigree. I do not have the title. Valerie let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. Pedigree is just a fragile shield used by incompetent men to protect their own mediocrity, she said. As of this exact moment, your title is Director of Strategic Integrity. You bypass every vice president in this building. You report directly and exclusively to me and to Mr. Sterling. Valerie reached under the heavy mahogany table and pulled out a sleek, brushed silver briefcase. She slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. I unlatched the metal clasps and opened it. Inside rested a top-of-the-line corporate laptop preloaded with unrestricted administrative clearance to every server, every financial log, and every encrypted email across the entire Sterling Corporation network. Resting right on top of the keyboard was a thick, heavy lanyard. Attached to it was a solid platinum access badge, My name was already engraved on the front, right below my new executive title. Valerie told me that my first official directive was to conduct a ruthless bottom-up audit of the operations department. I was to start with Garrett. I was to tear through his vendor logs, his expense reports, and his project budgets. If he was hiding something, she wanted it dragged out into the daylight before the merger closed. I looked at the platinum badge gleaming in the briefcase. I thought about the sheer suffocating humiliation I had endured just 24 hours ago. I thought about my parents standing in their lavish foyer, disowning me for refusing to bow down to a bully. I thought about Jasmine smirking at me, threatening to make sure I flipped burgers for the rest of my life. A deep, powerful warmth spread through my chest, replacing the lingering chill of the previous night. I took the platinum badge and slipped the lanyard over my neck. The cool metal rested against my chest, a physical anchor to my new reality. I looked at Harrison and signed a single profound thank you. He smiled a genuine, warm expression that told me he knew exactly what kind of storm I was about to unleash. Valerie informed me that human resources had already been notified of the structural change. However, I still needed to physically sign my internship closure documents on the 10th floor to formally transition my employment status in the system. I thanked them both, picked up the silver briefcase, and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, leaving me alone in the quiet, plush corridor of the 50th floor. I walked back to the private executive elevator, my posture completely different than it had been when I arrived. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer the family punching bag. I stepped into the mirrored cabin and pressed the button for the 10th floor. The elevator began its rapid, silent descent. I held the silver briefcase in my right hand, feeling the weight of the unrestricted administrative laptop inside. I watched the floor numbers tick down on the digital display. 40, 30, 20. My mind was already racing through data access protocols, planning exactly how I would begin pulling Garrett financial records. I was ready to dismantle his entire operation line by line. The elevator slowed as it approached the data analytics department. I took a deep breath, preparing to quickly sign my paperwork and head to my new corner office on the 45th floor. With a soft melodic chime, the heavy steel doors slid open. I stepped forward, but I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing directly in front of the elevator bay, blocking my path entirely, was Garrett. He was not alone. He was flanked by two massive uniformed corporate security guards. Garrett had his arms crossed over his chest, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, and a vicious, smug grin plastered across his face. The soft, melodic chime of the elevator echoed in the quiet space. The heavy steel doors slid open. I stepped forward, expecting to see the familiar rows of drab cubicles and the tired faces of my fellow data interns. Instead, I found myself face to face with the very man I had hoped to avoid for the rest of my life. Garrett stood directly in the center of the elevator bay, blocking my path entirely. He was flanked by two massive corporate security guards, their arms crossed over their broad chests. Garrett wore a vicious, smug grin that stretched perfectly across his pale face. He had clearly been waiting for me. The entire data analytics department had gone dead silent. The frantic clicking of keyboards and the low hum of office chatter had completely stopped. Dozens of junior analysts and interns poked their heads over their low partition walls, watching the scene unfold with wide, anxious eyes. Garrett thrived on this kind of spectacle. He stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against the polished floorboards, to ensure every single person on the 10th floor gave him their undivided attention. He announced to the room that I was officially trespassing on private corporate property. He said he knew I would try to sneak back up here to steal company data or beg the department head for my pathetic little internship back. His voice was loud, booming with that toxic arrogance he always wore like a shield. He wanted an audience. He wanted the junior staff who had watched him throw a tantrum in the lobby to see him reassert his dominance over me. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest and told the entire floor that this was what happened when ungrateful, incompetent people tried to bite the hand that fed them. Garrett did not stop there. He decided to drag our personal lives into the professional arena just to maximize my humiliation. He told the watching crowd that I was a burden to my own family. He said my parents had disowned me last night because I was a deeply unstable woman who could not handle the pressure of the real world. He bragged that his wife had begged him to give me a chance, but that some people were just destined to be failures. He turned to the two massive security guards and commanded them to confiscate the silver briefcase in my hand. He ordered them to grab me by the arms and physically drag me out of the building. The security guards took a heavy step forward, reaching out to grab my shoulders. A year ago, a week ago, even a day ago, my heart would have been pounding out of my chest. I would have dropped my gaze, apologized profusely, and let them humiliate me just to escape the confrontation. I would have shrunk down to the smallest possible version of myself to keep the peace. But standing there with the weight of the silver briefcase in my hand, I did not feel an ounce of fear. The woman who used to cower in front of this bully had died in the freezing rain the night before. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight and unwavering. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back. I simply lifted the sleek, brushed silver briefcase and rested it on my forearm. The metal was cold to the touch, but it gave me an incredible sense of grounding. I unlatched the twin metal clasps with a sharp, definitive click that echoed clearly in the dead-silent office. The guards paused, their eyes darting to the case, unsure if I was pulling out a weapon or a stolen hard drive. Inside, nestled next to the top of the line, corporate laptop loaded with unrestricted administrative clearance, lay the heavy platinum lanyard. I reached inside and pulled it out. I let the thick metal chain slide through my fingers, feeling its substantial weight before carefully placing it over my head. The solid platinum access badge rested squarely against my chest, catching the bright fluorescent lights of the office and reflecting them back like a shield. The security guards froze completely. Their eyes widened as they recognized the deep emerald seal and the unmistakable platinum crest. In the corporate hierarchy of Sterling Corporation, that specific badge design was legendary. It was reserved exclusively for the absolute highest tier of executive leadership. They knew exactly what that badge meant. It meant I had administrative clearance that bypassed their own head of corporate security. It meant my authority superseded any vice president in the building. The two massive men immediately dropped their hands and took 3 rapid steps backward, putting as much distance between themselves and me as physically possible. They lowered their heads, staring intently at the floor, terrified of making eye contact with the senior director. Garrett did not understand what was happening. He looked at the retreating guards with absolute fury, demanding to know what they were doing. He screamed at them to do their jobs and remove the trash from his floor. But the guards kept their heads down, refusing to make eye contact with him or with me. Garrett finally looked at my chest. He squinted at the glowing platinum badge, his brain struggling to process a reality that completely shattered his carefully constructed worldview. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face turning a mottled, ugly shade of red. He accused me of stealing an executive badge from the 50th floor. He yelled that impersonating a senior officer was a federal offense, and that I was going to rot in a prison cell for the rest of my life. He was unraveling right in front of the entire department, his illusion of absolute control crumbling into pathetic, desperate panic. He told me that Valerie was going to personally see me destroyed for stealing company property. Garrett looked around wildly, trying to find someone, anyone, who would validate his reality. The junior analysts and interns who had been watching the scene unfold were completely motionless. They saw the platinum badge gleaming on my chest. They saw the security guards backing away in sheer terror. The open plan office was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents overhead. Garrett was entirely alone in his delusion. I did not entertain his screaming. I did not try to explain the silent audit or the billionaire founder who had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I simply snapped the silver briefcase shut and took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Garrett instinctively took a step back, the false bravado evaporating from his eyes as he realized the security guards were not going to protect him. I closed the distance between us until I was standing well within his personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was exactly the same, but the power dynamic had entirely shifted. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous whisper that only he could hear over the murmurs of the stunned office. I told him that I did not report to him anymore. I told him that as of 10 minutes ago, he reported to me. I watched the arrogant, smug grin completely vanish from his face, replaced by a cold, creeping horror as the realization finally hit him. I leaned in just a fraction closer, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. I told him that I was the new director of strategic integrity, and then I delivered the final blow. I am auditing your entire department, Garrett, and I am starting with you. I left Garrett standing frozen in the middle of the data analytics floor. I did not wait for him to formulate a response or gather whatever shredded dignity he had left. I turned my back on him, walked past the rows of stunned junior analysts, and made my way back to the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the 45th floor, my new domain. When I stepped out of the elevator, I found myself in a sweeping corridor lined with modern glass offices. A digital directory on the wall already listed my name, Jada Washington, Director of Strategic Integrity. I followed the hallway to the very end, opening the heavy glass door to a massive corner office. It was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline. A sprawling mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, flanked by multiple high-resolution monitors. Just yesterday, I was crammed into a windowless cubicle eating cold soup out of a plastic container, while my younger coworkers gossiped about my thrift store clothes. Today, I owned the floor. I sat down in the plush leather chair and set the brushed silver briefcase on the desk. I opened it, taking out the top-of-the-line corporate laptop Valerie had given me. I connected it to the secure docking station and powered it up. The screen came alive, prompting me for my biometric scan. I pressed my thumb against the sensor. The system authenticated my platinum clearance, instantly granting me absolute unrestricted access to the entire Sterling Corporation digital infrastructure. I did not waste a single second. I opened the internal communications server and located the active digital footprint for the Vice President of Operations. Garrett. As a senior auditor investigating potential corporate fraud, I had the legal and administrative authority to monitor any unencrypted company device. I routed the live audio feed from his office phone directly into my headset. I slipped the headphones over my ears just in time to hear the frantic, heavy breathing of a man who knew his entire world was about to collapse. "Pick up the phone, Jasmine. Pick up the phone right now." Garrett was muttering to himself, pacing back and forth in his office. I could hear the sharp squeak of his expensive leather shoes pivoting on the hardwood floor. Finally, the line clicked open. "Garrett, I am at the spa." Jasmine answered, her voice dripping with that familiar, entitled annoyance. "I told you not to call me during my massage. What is so urgent that you had to interrupt my morning? Jasmine, you need to listen to me." Garrett gasped, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She was up here. She came back up to the 10th floor." "Who came back?" Jasmine asked, sounding completely bored. "Jada. I thought you told security to throw her in the street. Did the pathetic loser come back to beg for her internship? Just have her arrested for trespassing. I do not have time to deal with her mental breakdowns today. She is not an intern anymore." Jasmine. Garrett practically screamed into the receiver. His voice was shaking so badly he could barely form the words. She walked off the elevator wearing a platinum access badge. A platinum badge, Jasmine. Do you understand what that means? There was a brief pause on the line. I could almost see my sister waving away her massage therapist, her perfectly manicured nails gripping her expensive phone. "What are you talking about?" Jasmine demanded, her tone shifting from annoyed to confused. "Executive leadership wears those. You do not even have a platinum badge. She probably stole it from someone in the lobby. Call the police and have her locked up." "She did not steal it," Garrett wheezed, pacing faster now. "It had her name engraved on it. She looked me dead in the eye and told me she is the new director of strategic integrity. She reports directly to the chief executive officer and the founder of the company. She bypasses me entirely. Jasmine, she told me she is auditing my entire department. The line went dead quiet. For a long moment, the only sound in my headphones was Garrett hyperventilating. When Jasmine finally spoke, the arrogant confidence had completely vanished from her voice, replaced by a sharp, creeping dread. "Garrett," Jasmine whispered, her voice tight with fear. "If she audits your department, she is going to see the vendor accounts. She is going to see the transfers to Apex Solutions." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my leather chair. Apex Solutions. The name clicked into place perfectly. During my late nights studying the company financial architecture, I had noticed an external vendor by that name receiving massive recurring payments from the operations budget. I had always assumed it was a legitimate logistics contractor. But hearing the sheer terror in my sister's voice confirmed exactly what it really was. A shadow account. "She is going to see everything," Garrett sobbed, completely breaking down. "I inflated the quarterly operating costs to siphon those funds. $400,000 over the last 2 years, Jasmine. Where do you think the money came from to buy your diamond tennis bracelets? Where do you think the money came from to pay off your parents' massive suburban mortgage? If Jada opens those ledgers, she will trace the IP addresses right back to my personal bank accounts. It is a federal crime. I am going to go to federal prison, and you are going to lose the mansion. The IRS will freeze everything we own." I sat frozen in my new office, the horrible truth washing over me like ice water. My parents' grand sprawling estate in the suburbs, the imported Persian rugs, the crystal chandeliers, the very house where Calvin and Renee had proudly stood last night and disowned me for being a financial burden. It was all paid for with stolen money. They looked down on me for buying clothes at a thrift store while they were living a fraudulent lifestyle funded by corporate embezzlement. Jasmine's entire identity as the successful, wealthy golden child was nothing but a criminal illusion. Garrett was crying now, begging Jasmine to tell him what to do, terrified that his life was completely over. I waited to hear my sister apologize. I waited to hear her tell him they needed to confess, to hire a lawyer to take responsibility for the massive crime they had committed. But Jasmine did not cry. The fear in her voice hardened into something cold, calculating, and purely malicious. "Pull yourself together and listen to me," Jasmine hissed, her tone venomous and sharp. "We are not losing our money. I am not losing my house, and I am not letting my miserable failure of a sister take away the life I deserve. You still have your administrative login credentials from before she was promoted, right?" "I have them for now," Garrett stammered. "But her clearance overrides mine. It is only a matter of time before she locks me out of the mainframe." "Then you need to move faster than she does," Jasmine commanded. "We have to destroy her before she opens those files. Use your access to alter the digital signatures on the shadow account. Change the routing numbers. Leave breadcrumbs that point directly to her new executive login. Frame her for it. Make it look like she used her new promotion to steal the funds out of jealousy." I sat in the quiet of my corner office, listening to the very people who shared my blood actively conspire to send me to federal prison just to protect their stolen wealth. They had no idea I heard every single word. I took off the headset and laid it gently on the polished mahogany desk. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. Hearing my own sister orchestrate my absolute destruction should have broken me, but instead, it brought a profound, razor-sharp focus to my mind. I did not waste a single second mourning the family I never really had. I turned my attention back to the top-of-the-line laptop sitting in front of me. I opened the master server gateway and initiated my very first official data sweep as the new director of strategic integrity. I bypassed the standard user interfaces that executives like Garrett relied on. I dove straight into the raw back-end code of the Sterling Corporation financial servers. It only took me 12 minutes to locate the massive, glaring anomaly in the system. Garrett was moving incredibly fast, driven by pure, unadulterated terror. I sat in the quiet luxury of my new corner office and watched in real time as digital records began to alter and shift across my screen. He was utilizing lingering administrative privileges from an old IT transition he oversaw last year. Access codes he should have surrendered to cybersecurity months ago. I tracked his digital footprint as he infiltrated the shadow vendor account registered to Apex Solutions. I watched the cursor blink as he systematically tried to erase his own authorization history. He was overwriting the metadata on dozens of offshore transfers, stripping away his own digital signatures and replacing them with forged authorizations. Then I saw exactly what Jasmine had instructed him to do. He was planting a trail of deceptive breadcrumbs. He altered the routing codes and adjusted the timestamps to make it look like the fraudulent activity originated this very morning. He was meticulously framing the system to tell a very specific, devastating lie. He wanted the records to show that the exact second I was handed unrestricted executive clearance by the founder of the company, I immediately abused my power to embezzle $400,000 into hidden accounts. It was a digital landmine tailored specifically to obliterate my character, terminate my career, and send me directly to a federal prison cell. But Garrett was a man blinded by panic and his own toxic arrogance. He assumed that because I had been fetching coffee and organizing guest lists, I did not understand the architecture of the servers. He completely underestimated the 5 years I spent in the dark of my grandfather's house, aggressively studying advanced financial data systems. He thought he was being clever by bouncing his connection through a proxy, but his methodology was sloppy and rushed. I ran a rapid traceback protocol and cut right through his pathetic digital smokescreen. I isolated his true IP address in a matter of seconds. The signal pinged directly back to the private network in his 10th floor corner office. He was setting the trap right beneath my feet, entirely convinced I would be too stupid or too slow to catch him before the trap snapped shut. I opened a secure encrypted folder on my desktop. I needed to lock down the unedited server logs immediately. I had to compile the counter evidence and mirror the raw data before he finished overwriting the system registry. I needed to freeze his true digital footprint exactly where it was, so I could drop the undeniable catastrophic truth onto the boardroom table tomorrow. My fingers flew across the keyboard, rapidly typing out the command lines to quarantine the affected servers and copy the original metadata. I was seconds away from hitting the final execute key when a loud, sharp crash shattered the absolute silence of my office. The heavy glass door to my suite burst wide open, slamming against the rubber wall stop with a violent, aggressive thud. I pulled my hands away from the keyboard and looked up. Marching into my office with a storm of misplaced righteous fury were my parents, Calvin and Renee. Their faces were twisted into identical masks of furious, self-righteous indignation. They walked with the heavy stomping strides of people who had come to deliver a final crushing judgment. And right behind them, flanked by her protectors, was Jasmine. My sister was clutching a designer tissue to her face. Her shoulders were shaking, and she was letting out small, theatrical sobs. She had painted her face into a perfect picture of a devastated, heartbroken victim. They had stormed my executive office entirely convinced that they had already won. My father, Calvin, slammed his heavy hand against the polished mahogany of my new desk. The loud smack echoed off the glass walls of my office. He did not bother to ask how I got this office. He did not ask why I had a platinum badge resting against my chest. All he saw was an obstacle standing in the way of his favorite daughter. Jasmine stood slightly behind our parents, clutching a damp tissue. She let out a soft, trembling sob, playing the role of the devastated victim to absolute perfection. She looked at our mother with wide, tear-filled eyes and pointed a shaking finger at me. "Tell her to stop, Mom." Jasmine whimpered, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "Tell her to stop trying to ruin my life." Garrett told me everything. He told me how Jada used her new security clearance to steal $400,000 from the company accounts this morning. And now she is manipulating the data to make it look like Garrett did it. She is trying to send my husband to prison just because she is jealous of my marriage. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair. I looked at the glowing laptop screen where the raw server logs clearly showed Garrett actively trying to cover up his 2-year embezzlement scheme. I could have turned the monitor around right then and there. I could have shown my parents the undeniable digital proof that their wealthy white son-in-law was a common thief who had been using stolen corporate funds to pay their mortgage. But as I looked at Calvin and Renee, I realized something deeply profound. Evidence would not matter to them. Truth was completely irrelevant in this room. Renee stepped around the desk, invading my personal space. She did not look at me with the anger she had shown in her foyer the night before. Instead, she wore a mask of desperate pleading manipulation. She placed her hands flat on my desk, leaning in close so I could smell the strong, cloying scent of her floral perfume. "Jada, you have to fix this," Renee pleaded, her voice dropping to a frantic, urgent whisper. "You have to take the fall for this." I stared at my mother, my brain struggling to process the sheer monstrous audacity of her request. I kept my voice entirely flat. "You want me to confess to a federal crime I did not commit. You want me to go to prison." Renee did not even flinch. She leaned in closer, her eyes wide and pleading. "Think about your sister Jada. Think about her family. If Garrett gets arrested, all of their assets will be frozen. The government will seize the mansion. They will take away everything Jasmine has built. You cannot do that to her. You are 35 years old. You have no husband. You have no children. You do not have a legacy to protect. Jasmine's life is just starting, and your life does not matter as much as hers. Take the plea deal, Jada. Accept the charges. It is what family does." The air in my office seemed to completely evaporate. My own mother had just looked me dead in the eye and told me that my life was entirely worthless. She had just asked me to spend a decade in a federal prison cell so my sister could keep buying designer clothes with stolen money. Calvin crossed his arms, nodding in stern agreement with his wife. "You owe us," he barked, his voice laced with that familiar toxic authority. "We put a roof over your head. We raised you. Now it is time for you to step up and protect the family name. You go down to Human Resources right now, you hand over that platinum badge, and you sign a confession stating that you acted alone out of spite. If you do this for us, we will make sure Garrett puts money in your commissary account while you serve your time." I looked at the three people standing in my office. I saw the absolute greed rotting them from the inside out. They were so desperate to maintain their illusion of wealth and superiority that they would gladly feed me to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. For 35 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating burden of trying to be a good daughter. I had sacrificed my youth, my peace, and my career to earn a scrap of their affection. But staring into their cold, selfish eyes, that burden simply vanished. The last remaining thread of my familial loyalty snapped, leaving behind nothing but a quiet, absolute resolve. If I fought them right now, if I screamed and defended myself, they would immediately run back to Garrett. They would warn him that I was fighting back, and he would have the time he needed to finish scrubbing the servers and completely destroy the evidence. I could not let that happen. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to believe they had won so Garrett would walk blindly into the trap I was setting. I slowly lowered my gaze to the desk, forcing my shoulders to slump. I let out a long, defeated sigh, playing the role of the broken, compliant daughter they expected me to be. I looked back up at my mother, making sure my expression was completely blank. "You are right," I said softly. My voice was quiet, stripped of all resistance. "I understand what I have to do." Jasmine let out a massive, dramatic sigh of relief, dropping the damp tissue from her face. "I knew you would do the right thing, Jada," she said, her smug, arrogant smile instantly returning. "Garrett is presenting the financial audit at the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. You just need to sit there and admit what you did." "I will address everything at the board meeting tomorrow," I replied, my tone perfectly even. "I will make sure the entire board of directors hears exactly what happened with the money." Renee reached out and patted my hand, a gesture so profoundly fake it made my skin crawl. "Thank you, Jada. This is for the best. You are finally acting like a real part of this family." Calvin gave a gruff, satisfied nod, completely convinced that he had successfully bullied me into submission. The three of them turned around and marched out of my office, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind them. They walked down the corridor with their heads held high, entirely certain that they had just saved their stolen empire. They had no idea that they had just handed me the match to burn their entire world to the ground. I sat in the dead silence of my office and waited until their footsteps completely faded away. I locked my eyes back onto my computer screen. Garrett was still logged into the back end, still clumsily trying to alter the offshore routing numbers. I reached out and gently tapped the keyboard, executing the quarantine command I had prepared before they barged in. The system flashed green, confirming that the raw, unedited server logs were now completely locked down and securely mirrored to an encrypted file. Garrett fake breadcrumbs were trapped exactly where I wanted them. I reached over and picked up my headset. It was time to make a very important phone call. I kept my hand resting on the headset for a brief moment, listening to the absolute silence of my office. The faint hum of the server tower's cooling fans was the only sound left in the room. I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to the heavy glass door. I turned the deadbolt until it clicked firmly into place. I reached up and pulled the cord to drop the opaque privacy blinds, sealing myself off entirely from the rest of the executive floor. I was completely alone. A younger version of me. The woman who had spent 35 years begging for a scrap of validation from Calvin and Renee might have collapsed onto the floor. She might have wept at the sheer monstrous cruelty of a mother asking her daughter to go to federal prison just to protect a son-in-law credit limit. But I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were completely dry. My breathing was slow and measured. The profound betrayal I had just experienced did not break me. It liberated me. I was no longer tied to their toxic expectations. I was a surgeon preparing to cut out a massive tumor, and I needed absolute precision to do it. I walked back to my mahogany desk and put the headset on. I brought up the secure, encrypted communications interface on my laptop. I bypassed the standard corporate directories and dialed a direct peer-to-peer video channel that Valerie had established for me during my promotion just hours ago. The connection was heavily encrypted, shielded from any internal monitoring or data sweeps. The screen went black for a fraction of a second before the video feed snapped into high-definition clarity. Valerie appeared on the monitor. She was sitting in the same sprawling executive boardroom on the 50th floor, her posture just as commanding and flawless as it had been this morning. Sitting right beside her, illuminated by the soft natural light pouring in from the skyline windows, was Harrison Sterling. The billionaire founder leaned forward slightly as the connection went live, his deep brown eyes immediately locking onto the camera. Valerie did not offer a casual greeting. She took one look at my face and asked me for a status report. I did not speak a single word of English out loud. I knew the glass walls of my office were thick, but I was not going to risk Garrett or any of his loyalists walking by and overhearing a single syllable of this conversation. I needed absolute operational security. I raised my hands in front of the webcam, ensuring I was perfectly centered in the frame. I looked directly at Harrison and began to sign. I signed with rapid, fluid precision. I told the founder of the company exactly what his vice president of operations was currently doing on the 10th floor. I outlined the entire scope of the digital sabotage. I explained how Garrett had utilized a set of expired administrative access codes to infiltrate the financial servers. I detailed how he was aggressively overwriting the metadata on the offshore transfers to the shadow vendor known as Apex Solutions. I signed that Garrett was actively altering routing numbers and manipulating timestamps to make it look like the $400,000 embezzlement originated from my new executive login credentials. Harrison watched my hands intently. His face remained perfectly still, but the sharp, calculating gleam in his eyes intensified with every gesture I made. I did not stop there. I continued signing, laying out the complete depth of the conspiracy. I told Harrison and Valerie that my own family had just stormed into my office to aid in the cover-up. I explained how my sister Jasmine had fabricated a story about my jealousy and how my parents had aggressively demanded that I sign a false confession and take a federal plea deal to protect Garrett's reputation and their stolen wealth. Valerie's expression darkened into a mask of pure corporate fury. I could see the muscles in her jaw clench as she processed the sheer audacity of a vice president weaponizing a data intern family to cover up a massive financial crime right under her nose. I signed my counter-strategy to Harrison. I told him that I did not fight my parents. I explained that I played the role of the broken submissive daughter they expected me to be. I told them I would take the fall at the emergency board meeting tomorrow. I did this because I needed them to drop their guard. I needed Garrett to feel absolutely invincible so he would stop looking over his shoulder. Then I raised my hands and delivered the final, crucial piece of information. I signed that before Garrett could finish scrubbing his digital footprint, I had executed a deep system quarantine. I had successfully isolated and locked down the raw, unedited server logs. I told Harrison that I had successfully mirrored the original metadata to an encrypted drive physically disconnected from the main network. I had the absolute undeniable digital proof of Garrett embezzlement, his subsequent sabotage, and his direct IP address, tying him to the entire fraudulent operation. The trap was set and the evidence was completely secure. I lowered my hands and waited. The boardroom on the 50th floor was dead silent. Valerie looked at Harrison, waiting for his direction. The elderly founder leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who was quietly preparing to dismantle an empire to save its foundation. Harrison raised his hands. His movements were slow, deliberate, and carried the heavy weight of absolute finality. He signed a message directly to me, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous authority. He told me that for far too long arrogance and greed had been allowed to fester in the shadows of his company. He signed that Garrett believed his privilege made him bulletproof, and tomorrow morning he would learn exactly how fragile that armor really was. Harrison then signed a single chilling directive that made the blood run cold in my veins. He instructed me to walk into the emergency board of directors meeting tomorrow morning and say absolutely nothing. He told me to let Garrett stand up in front of the entire executive leadership team. Let him present his fabricated financial logs. Let him spin his malicious lies and try to destroy my character in front of the most powerful people in the building. Let him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. Harrison locked eyes with the camera, his final gesture sharp and unforgiving. Let him present his fake evidence to the board. Then we cut off the head of the snake. I gave a single firm nod of agreement. The video feed cut out, leaving my office in complete silence once again. I reached over and disconnected the encrypted hard drive containing the raw server logs, slipping it safely into the inner pocket of my blazer. I had my orders. The bait was laid. My family thought they had successfully bullied me into sacrificing my freedom for their luxury. Garrett thought he had outsmarted the system and secured his precious promotion. They were all going to sleep incredibly well tonight, entirely convinced that their toxic kingdom was safe. I sat back in my chair, watching the city lights of Atlanta begin to flicker to life through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had 35 years of suppressed anger fueling me, and an encrypted drive holding the key to my absolute vindication. Tomorrow morning, the golden child and her arrogant husband were going to learn that the scapegoat was no longer playing by their rules. Tomorrow, the entire corporate hierarchy was going to watch them burn. The morning sun broke over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the 50th floor. I walked into boardroom 1 with my head held high. The encrypted hard drive rested heavy and secure in the inside pocket of my blazer, pressing against my chest like a shield of absolute truth. The room was already packed. A dozen senior directors and executive board members sat around the massive mahogany table. Their expressions were grave and tightly controlled. The atmosphere was thick with corporate anxiety. They were preparing for an execution, and I was supposed to be the sacrifice. At the head of the room stood Garrett. He was entirely in his element. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost a month of my old intern salary. He looked incredibly rested, radiating the toxic, untouchable confidence of a man who firmly believed he had just successfully committed the perfect crime. Behind him, a massive digital projector illuminated the wall, displaying the fabricated financial logs he had spent the previous afternoon desperately doctoring. Sitting in the plush gallery, seating at the back of the room, positioned perfectly to watch my downfall, was Jasmine. My younger sister wore a pristine white designer dress, her legs crossed gracefully. The diamond tennis bracelet Garrett had bought her with stolen company funds glittered on her wrist. She held a cup of coffee, looking more like she was attending an exclusive fashion show than a corporate tribunal. When I walked in, she caught my eye and offered a small, vicious smirk. She genuinely believed I was walking blindly into my own slaughter just to save her mansion. Garrett cleared his throat, commanding the undivided attention of the room. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Valerie and Harrison Sterling, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured sorrow. He paced slowly at the front of the room, using his white-collar authority to manipulate every single person at the table. He told the board that it brought him absolutely no pleasure to call this emergency meeting. He claimed that he had spent the entire night uncovering a massive, catastrophic breach of company trust. He pressed a button on his remote, and the screen flashed to the altered offshore routing numbers. The fake data was highlighted in bright red, a digital landmine tailored specifically to destroy my life. Garrett passionately wove a tale of absolute fiction. He told the board that I was a bitter, jealous woman who had spent my entire life resenting my younger sister and her success. He claimed that he and Jasmine had taken pity on me, giving me a chance to rebuild my life with a simple data entry internship. He spun a narrative that when Valerie graciously promoted me yesterday, the sudden taste of executive power had completely corrupted my mind. He pointed sharply to the screen showing the forged timestamps. He stated that within hours of receiving my Platinum Access badge, I had bypassed cybersecurity protocols and embezzled $400,000 into a hidden shadow account. He painted a picture of a deeply unstable, vindictive liability who was actively trying to bankrupt the company out of pure family spite. He said I was a threat to the impending merger and a danger to the financial integrity of Sterling Corporation. A heavy, suffocating gasp rippled through the boardroom. The directors shook their heads, whispering to each other in harsh, judgmental tones. They looked at me with open disgust, entirely convinced by the slick, polished presentation of a vice president. They saw exactly what Garrett wanted them to see: a failed 35-year-old intern who had finally snapped. Garrett raised his voice, demanding absolute, immediate justice. He told the board that I needed to be stripped of my clearance and terminated on the spot. He demanded that my bank accounts be frozen and that I be arrested for grand larceny and corporate espionage right here in this building. He played the victim flawlessly, claiming that his only mistake was trying to help a broken, ungrateful family member. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk. I let him lay out every single lie, every forged document, every fabricated timeline. I watched him dig his own grave so deep that he would never be able to climb out of it. I glanced back at the gallery. Jasmine was dabbing her eyes with a designer tissue, pretending to weep at the tragedy of her criminal sister. It was a flawless performance, a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. My own flesh and blood had plotted to send me to a federal cage, and they were savoring every single second of my supposed destruction. 35 years of trying to earn my family love culminated in this exact moment. They were entirely morally bankrupt, and I was finally free of them. Garrett finished his grand presentation. He lowered his remote, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked down at me with absolute victorious contempt. The entire room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Every single eye in the boardroom shifted away from the projector screen and locked directly onto me. Valerie sat perfectly still at the center of the table. Her emerald green suit caught the morning light, her face a smooth, unreadable mask of corporate authority. Beside her, Harrison Sterling sat quietly, his deep brown eyes watching the entire spectacle with a cold, terrifying calm. Valerie leaned forward, steepling her fingers on the polished wood. Her voice sliced through the tension in the room like a blade. "Jada," Valerie said smoothly, echoing my name off the glass walls. "You have just been accused of a massive federal crime by the Vice President of Operations. The evidence he has presented is highly damning. Do you have absolutely anything to say in your defense before I call security into this room?" I took a slow, steady breath. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and pushed myself up from my chair. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my blazer. The room was absolutely silent, waiting for me to beg or scream or break down in tears. I looked past the board of directors. I looked past my smirking sister in the gallery. I locked eyes directly with Garrett. I saw the arrogant certainty shining in his eyes. I did not speak a single word of English. I kept my mouth entirely closed. The corporate predators sitting around this mahogany table expected me to shout. They expected me to cry, to beg for my job, or to launch into a loud emotional outburst that they could easily write off as the erratic behavior of a failed, desperate intern. I gave them absolutely nothing but profound, deliberate silence. I slowly turned my body away from Garrett, entirely dismissing his existence as if he were nothing more than a stain on the floor. I shifted my focus to the far end of the massive boardroom table. Harrison Sterling sat there in his immaculate midnight blue suit. He was watching me with an expression of quiet anticipation, his deep brown eyes steady and waiting. I raised my hands. I kept my fingers steady, drawing on the years of patient, quiet communication I had shared with my late grandfather. I began to sign. My movements were rapid, flawless, and surgically precise. I did not simplify the vocabulary. I used advanced, specific corporate financial terminology, translating the exact nature of Garrett digital sabotage into American Sign Language. I signed with the absolute confidence of a woman who knew she held the winning hand. A sharp, derisive laugh cut through the heavy tension of the boardroom. Garrett slapped his hand against his wooden podium, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" he scoffed, pointing a polished finger at me. "What is this? Is she throwing gang signs? Is this some sort of pathetic interpretive dance?" He looked toward the board of directors, throwing his hands up in a gesture of exaggerated pity. "You see what I have been dealing with. I tried to give this woman a chance, and she is having a full-blown psychotic break right in front of us. Security needs to put her in a straitjacket before she hurts someone." In the gallery, I could see my sister Jasmine giggling behind her manicured hand. She leaned over and whispered something to the executive sitting next to her, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. She genuinely thought my silent communication was the ultimate proof of my mental collapse. She thought she was watching the final embarrassing seconds of my corporate execution. She was already planning what designer handbag she was going to buy to celebrate my downfall. I did not stop signing. I ignored their mocking laughter and finished my detailed report to the founder of the company. I lowered my hands to my sides and stood perfectly still. For a fraction of a second, the room remained suspended in Garrett arrogant laughter. Then Harrison Sterling leaned forward. He placed his elbows on the polished wood. He raised his hands. His signs were sharp, commanding, and filled with the unmistakable authority of a man who had built this multi-billion-dollar empire with his bare hands. He looked at Garrett with a disgust so pure it practically lowered the temperature in the room. He signed a long, rapid sequence, his eyes burning with righteous fury. Garrett frowned, his laughter abruptly dying in his throat, as he realized the old man was actively responding to me. "What is he doing?" Garrett snapped, looking at Valerie with a mix of confusion and irritation. "Tell him to stop waving his hands around. Get her out of here." Valerie did not call security. She pushed her heavy leather chair back and stood up. She smoothed the front of her emerald green suit, her face a mask of absolute terrifying composure. "He is not waving his hands around, Garrett," Valerie said, her voice slicing through the boardroom like a scalpel. "He is speaking, and I suggest you listen very carefully." Valerie paced slowly down the length of the table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The entire board of directors went dead silent, captivated by the sudden shift in power. "Jada is telling Mr. Sterling exactly how you manipulated the back end of our financial servers this morning," Valerie translated, projecting her voice so every single director in the room could hear her perfectly. "She is explaining how you utilized a set of expired administrative access codes to infiltrate the vendor accounts. She is telling him exactly how you used a shadow vendor named Apex Solutions to funnel $400,000 of company money into your personal offshore accounts over the last 2 years." The color drained from Garrett's face instantly. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable glow that had surrounded him all morning completely evaporated, leaving behind a pale, terrified shell of a man. The board members around the table gasped. Several senior directors sat up straight, their eyes darting from Valerie to Garrett in absolute shock. The pristine narrative Garrett had spent the last hour weaving was collapsing right in front of their eyes. "That is a lie!" Garrett stammered, his voice cracking as he gripped the edges of his podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "She is lying. She is making this up to save herself." That old man does not know what he is talking about. He is just some senile prop she brought in to confuse you. In the gallery, Jasmine had completely stopped laughing. She sat frozen in her pristine white designer dress, her hands clutching her expensive purse. The illusion of her perfect wealthy life was shattering, and she knew it. The smug superiority melted off her face, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Valerie ignored Garrett, frantic stammering. She kept her eyes locked on him, continuing her ruthless translation of Harrison signs. "Mr. Sterling also notes that you were incredibly sloppy," Valerie said smoothly. "He says you attempted to frame our new director of strategic integrity by altering the timestamps in digital signatures. But you failed to realize that Jada had already placed a deep system quarantine on the raw, unedited server logs before you could finish scrubbing your tracks." "You have absolutely no proof!" Garrett shouted, his voice reaching a shrill, desperate pitch. He slammed his hand against the podium, pointing wildly at the projector screen behind him. "The logs on the screen show she did it. You are going to take the word of a crazy intern over a vice president. Where is the proof?" I did not wait for Valerie to answer him. I reached inside the inner pocket of my blazer. My fingers closed around the cold, solid metal of the encrypted hard drive. I pulled it out, holding it up high so every single person in the room could see it clearly. I walked calmly over to the master projector console at the center of the massive table. I bypassed Garrett's presentation remote and plugged the USB drive directly into the primary terminal. I hit a single execution key on the console keyboard. The massive screen behind Garrett flickered violently. His fabricated, doctored financial logs vanished completely. In their place, the screen illuminated with the immutable encrypted bank records I had secured. The raw data showed exactly where the stolen $400,000 had gone. The entire board of directors stared at the massive screen, reading the undeniable, catastrophic proof of Garrett direct deposits paying for Jasmine luxury car loans and my father Calvin's sprawling suburban mortgage. I did not lower my hands. I kept my gaze locked directly onto the screen as the evidence of Garrett guilt washed over the entire executive board. The room erupted into absolute bedlam. Directors were shouting over one another, pointing at the screen and demanding immediate explanations from the finance committee. The sophisticated, controlled environment of Boardroom 1 shattered into pieces. Garrett stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping against the hardwood floor as if he had been physically struck. He hit the edge of the mahogany table, his mouth opening and closing in a desperate, pathetic attempt to formulate an excuse. But there was no excuse. The encrypted bank records were immutable. They clearly showed $400,000 moving directly from the operations budget into a shadow vendor account and then instantly transferring out to pay for a sprawling suburban mansion and a luxury sports car. My parents' mansion. My sister's car. "It is a mistake," Garrett stammered, his voice cracking violently as he raised his hands in surrender. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, begging someone, anyone, to believe him. "She forged those records. I am the vice president of operations. I would never risk my career for this. You have to believe me." Valerie stood up from her chair, her emerald green suit immaculate against the chaos of the room. She picked up her sleek corporate smartphone from the table and pressed a single button on the screen. She did not say a word. She simply looked at Garrett with a cold, terrifying finality. The heavy mahogany doors to the boardroom burst open. 3 massive corporate security guards marched into the room, their expressions grim and strictly professional. But they were not alone. Flanking them were 2 plainclothes police officers, their badges clipped visibly to their belts. They did not look at me. They did not even glance in my direction. They moved with a swift, aggressive purpose, bypassing my chair entirely and making a direct line for the front of the room. Garrett let out a high, panicked noise as the officers closed in on him. He scrambled sideways, trying to put the podium between himself and the authorities. "Wait!" he shrieked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You cannot do this! I am being framed! You are making a huge mistake!" The taller of the 2 police officers grabbed Garrett by the upper arm, hauling him forward with a rough, undeniable force. He spun Garrett around, forcing his arms behind his back, and secured a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking into place silenced the remaining shouts of the board directors. Garrett Washington, the officer said, his voice deep and entirely unsympathetic. You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. No. Garrett screamed, thrashing against the officer's grip as they began to physically drag him toward the boardroom doors. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto mine with a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. Jada, please. Tell them the truth. Tell them you did it. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching the man who had publicly humiliated me yesterday get hauled out of the room like a common criminal. I did not offer him a single shred of pity. I simply watched him face the absolute consequences of his own arrogance. As Garrett was dragged screaming through the heavy wooden doors, a sudden frantic buzzing sound vibrated against the mahogany table. My phone resting right next to my silver briefcase was lighting up. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller ID flashed brightly, demanding my immediate attention. It was Jasmine. I slowly turned my head and looked toward the plush gallery seating at the back of the room. My sister was standing up, her hands trembling violently as she held her phone to her ear. The smug, vicious smirk she had worn just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. Her pristine white designer dress suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of her husband's arrest. She was staring at me through the glass partition, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate realization. She knew exactly what I had just done. She knew that her entire life, her mansion, her luxury cars, her social standing was officially over. I reached out and picked up my phone. I held it up so Jasmine could see exactly what I was doing. I locked eyes with her through the thick glass, holding her terrified gaze. I pressed my thumb against the red icon on the screen, and I declined the call. 3 weeks passed since the heavy mahogany doors of Boardroom 1 closed behind Garrett. The fallout was swift, brutal, and absolute. The federal authorities did not waste a single day. Armed with the immutable encrypted server logs and the offshore bank records, I had secured the prosecutors built an airtight, catastrophic case. Garrett was denied bail. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a minimum of 10 years behind bars for grand larceny, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. But the destruction did not stop with him. The IRS swooped in like starving vultures. The moment they traced the stolen corporate funds to my family personal accounts, the government froze everything. They locked down every single one of Jasmine's bank accounts. The luxury sports cars were repossessed right out of her pristine driveway. The sprawling suburban mansion, the crown jewel of her fake empire, was seized by federal authorities. The illusion of my sister as the perfect, untouchable golden child shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Calvin and Renee were not spared from the blast radius. Because Garrett had been funneling stolen corporate money directly into their accounts to pay their exorbitant mortgage, their assets were flagged in the federal investigation. The bank immediately initiated foreclosure proceedings on their grand estate. The affluent social circle they had spent decades trying to impress dropped them instantly. Country club memberships were revoked overnight. Dinner party invitations simply vanished. They went from being the envy of their gated community to social pariahs in the blink of an eye. Their entire identity, built on greed and stolen prestige, was reduced to ash. I had ignored dozens of frantic voicemails and desperate text messages from them over the past 3 weeks. But on a crisp Tuesday morning, I finally agreed to meet them one last time. I did not invite them to my office, and I certainly did not go to their house. I chose a busy, neutral coffee shop in downtown Atlanta. I wanted witnesses, and I wanted an easy exit. I wore a tailored navy blue suit I had purchased with my first executive paycheck. I felt calm, grounded, and entirely in control of my reality. When I arrived at the cafe, they were already sitting at a small metal table outside on the patio. I almost did not recognize them. Jasmine was not wearing flawless silk. She was not dripping in diamonds. She wore a wrinkled, oversized sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy, unkempt knot. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen and bloodshot from weeks of crying. Calvin looked as though he had aged 10 years. His shoulders were slumped, the toxic, aggressive authority completely drained from his posture. Renee looked frantic, clutching a paper coffee cup with trembling hands, jumping at every loud noise on the street. They looked exactly like what they were: desperate, broken people who had lost their only source of stolen power. I walked up to the table, but I did not sit down. Renee jumped up the moment she saw me. She forced a wide, brittle smile onto her face and reached out her arms as if to hug me. I took a deliberate step back, keeping my hands firmly at my sides. Her smile faltered, but she quickly masked it with a look of manufactured, desperate maternal affection. "Jada, thank God you came!" Renee gushed, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "We have been so worried about you. We saw the news about your promotion. We always knew you were a genius, sweetheart. We always knew you had this incredible talent inside you." Calvin stood up next, nodding eagerly, his hands open in a pleading gesture. "We were completely manipulated, Jada," he said, his voice lacking any of its former booming confidence. "Garrett lied to all of us. He told us you were the one causing trouble. We had no idea he was a criminal. You have to believe us. We are victims in this too. We trusted him and he destroyed our family." Jasmine let out a loud, pathetic sob. She looked up at me with terrified, desperate eyes. "Jada, please," Jasmine begged, her voice cracking. "They took the cars. The bank is taking the house. I have absolutely nothing left. My credit cards are declining at the grocery store. You are a senior director now. You make a massive salary. You have to help us. Please, you have to talk to Valerie and the board. Tell them we did not know where the money came from. Give us a loan to save Mom and Dad house. We are going to be on the street." I looked at the three of them. I listened to their pathetic, desperate lies. They were still trying to rewrite history. They were still trying to pretend that just 3 weeks ago, they had not marched into my office and demanded I go to federal prison so Jasmine could keep her credit limit. They did not feel an ounce of remorse for how they had treated me for 35 years. They did not care about the emotional abuse, the constant belittling, or the fact that they disowned me in the freezing rain. They were only sorry that they got caught, and they were only acting nice now because I was the only person left with a checkbook. I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping away any trace of the desperate daughter who used to crave their validation. "I did not come here to reconcile," I said clearly, letting the heavy words cut through the ambient noise of the busy street. "I came here to look you in the eye and tell you that your conditional love is a currency I no longer accept." Renee let out a sharp gasp, stepping forward. "Jada, you cannot mean that. We are your parents." I held up a single hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. "I do not care about your mansion." I continued, my gaze locking onto my sister, then my father, then my mother. "I do not care about your foreclosure or your frozen bank accounts. You were perfectly willing to let me rot in a federal cage to protect a thief. You chose your side. You chose your golden child and your wealthy son-in-law. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." Calvin's jaw tightened, a brief flash of his old anger surfacing. "You are going to turn your back on your own blood just because you have a little money now. Blood just means we are related," I said softly, staring right through him. "It does not make you family. I survived without you when I had absolutely nothing. I will certainly thrive without you now. Do not ever contact me again." I did not wait for their protests. I did not wait for Jasmine to start crying again or for Renee to hurl insults. I turned my back on them and walked away down the bustling Atlanta sidewalk. I kept my head high, my posture straight, and my steps purposeful. I did not look over my shoulder even once. I left them sitting at that small metal table, completely surrounded by the ruins of their own greed. 6 months can feel like an entire lifetime when you finally stop carrying the dead weight of other people's toxic expectations. I woke up on a crisp Tuesday morning in a spacious, sunlit apartment overlooking the city. The suffocating anxiety that used to dictate my every waking moment was completely gone. In its place was a profound, deeply rooted peace. I had spent my entire life trying to shrink myself down to make my parents and my sister comfortable. I had let them convince me that I was a burden, a failure, a woman who was destined to live in the shadows. But as I stood in front of my full-length mirror, the woman looking back at me was entirely unrecognizable from the exhausted intern who had been publicly humiliated half a year ago. I fastened the buttons of a custom-tailored burgundy suit. The fabric was immaculate, the cut sharp and precise. It fit me perfectly. It was not armor meant to intimidate the people around me, but a reflection of the quiet, unshakable confidence I had painstakingly built from the ashes of my family absolute betrayal. I reached over to my dresser, picked up my heavy platinum access badge, and let the lanyard settle around my neck. The cool metal rested against my chest, a daily reminder of the day I stopped running and decided to stand my ground. I grabbed my briefcase and headed out the door. I did not drive a rusted 10-year-old sedan anymore, but I had not bought a flashy luxury sports car either. I had purchased a reliable, comfortable vehicle that I owned completely free of any debt or leverage. As I navigated the bustling Atlanta morning traffic toward the financial district, my phone remained delightfully quiet. I had changed my number months ago. Calvin, Renee, and Jasmine had absolutely no way to reach me. The last I heard through the corporate grapevine, Jasmine had filed for bankruptcy, and my parents had been forced to move into a tiny, cramped rental apartment in a city 3 hours away. Garrett was currently serving his sentence in a federal facility. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I rarely even thought about them anymore. They were ghosts from a previous life, a nightmare I had finally woken up from. I pulled into the private underground parking garage at Sterling Corporation, sliding into the executive spot with my name painted clearly on the concrete wall. I took the private elevator up to the main ground floor, needing to grab a coffee from the lobby cafe before heading up to the 50th floor. I stepped out into the sprawling, magnificent marble atrium. The morning rush was chaotic and loud, filled with the sharp clicking of expensive leather shoes and the low, urgent hum of corporate deal-making. The morning sun poured through the massive glass ceiling, casting bright, warm light across the floor. I walked slowly, taking in the sheer scale of the building. This was the exact same room where my life had shattered and rebuilt itself in the span of a single hour. I walked right past the spot where Garrett had kicked my cardboard box. I walked past the security turnstiles where I had placed my body between an angry guard and an elderly deaf man who just wanted to be seen. The security guards stationed at the front desk saw me approaching. These were the same men who used to sneer at my thrift store clothes. Today they immediately straightened their posture, offering polite, respectful nods. "Good morning, Director Washington," the head guard said, his voice carrying a tone of deep, genuine respect. "Good morning, Marcus," I replied, offering him a warm, professional smile. I continued my walk toward the cafe, feeling completely anchored in my own skin. I had spent the last 6 months relentlessly overhauling the data integrity of this company. I had rooted out the toxic, corrupt elements Garrett had left behind, and under Valerie and Harrison guidance, I had helped build a culture that actually valued transparency and respect. I held immense power in this building now, but I refused to wield it the way my brother-in-law had. As I approached the center of the lobby, a loud, chaotic crash echoed over the ambient noise of the crowd. I stopped and turned my head. About 20 feet away, right in the middle of the busiest walkway, a young African-American woman had tripped over her own feet. She was wearing a slightly oversized, inexpensive black blazer that reminded me so fiercely of the clothes I used to wear. She had been carrying a massive stack of thick, heavy financial dossiers, and they had all gone tumbling to the floor. Hundreds of loose papers fanned out across the polished Italian marble like a messy, disorganized carpet. The young woman dropped to her knees in absolute panic. Her hands were shaking violently as she desperately tried to gather the scattered documents. "I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice high and tight with terror. "I am so sorry. I will get it out of the way. Please excuse me." The executives and senior analysts striding past her did not stop to help. Some of them let out annoyed sighs, stepping over her and her papers as if she were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle in their path. A few people rolled their eyes, muttering about how the new intern class was entirely incompetent. I watched the young woman frantically scrambling on the floor, her eyes wide with that deep, familiar fear. She was terrified that this one mistake was going to cost her everything. She was terrified that someone was going to start screaming at her, that she was going to be publicly humiliated, fired, and thrown out into the street. I saw the crushing weight of imposter syndrome pressing down on her narrow shoulders. I did not call for maintenance. I did not walk past her. I did not look down on her from the safe, comfortable height of my executive status. I set my expensive silver briefcase down on the floor. I walked right into the middle of the busy walkway, ignoring the annoyed executives who had to alter their path to go around me. I knelt down on the cold marble floor, right across from the panicking young woman. She flinched slightly, expecting me to yell at her to get out of the way. I reached out and gently placed my hand over her trembling fingers, stopping her frantic gathering. "Take a deep breath," I said softly, keeping my voice warm and incredibly steady. "The papers are not going anywhere, and neither are you. It is okay." The young woman blinked, her chest heaving as she let out a shaky breath. She looked up at my face, and then her eyes dropped to the heavy platinum badge resting against my tailored burgundy suit. The color drained from her cheeks as she realized she had just dropped a massive pile of garbage directly in the path of a senior director. "I am so sorry, Director," she whispered, her voice shaking even harder. "It is my first week. I just got this internship. I promise I am not usually this clumsy. Please do not report me to Human Resources. I really need this job." I offered her a gentle, knowing smile. I began picking up the scattered folders, neatly tapping the loose papers together against the marble floor to organize them. "I know exactly how you feel," I told her, handing a perfectly stacked pile of documents back into her hands. "I started here as an intern, too. I know how intimidating this building can be. I know how hard it is to feel like you belong in a room full of people who act like they own the world. But you do not have to be afraid of making a mistake. You are here because you earned your spot. You belong here just as much as anyone else in a tailored suit." The young woman stared at me, her eyes slowly filling with tears of profound relief. The absolute terror that had gripped her face began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile spark of hope. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and then I offered her my hand. She took it, and I pulled her up from the floor. "What is your name?" I asked her. "Chloe," she said, clutching the organized folders tightly to her chest. "Well, Chloe," I replied, picking up my own briefcase. "If anyone gives you a hard time today, or if you ever feel like you are drowning in all this corporate noise, you come up to the 45th floor and ask for Jada Washington. My door is always open for you. Understand?" Chloe nodded vigorously, a bright, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "Thank you so much, Director Washington. I will not forget this." I watched her walk toward the elevator banks, her posture a little straighter, her steps a little more confident. She was no longer a terrified girl shrinking under the weight of the corporate machine. She had been seen. She had been validated. I turned and continued my walk toward the cafe, a deep, resonant warmth filling my chest. The trauma my family inflicted on me could have easily turned me into someone cold, bitter, and ruthless. I could have taken the power Harrison Sterling gave me and used it to crush every single person who ever looked at me sideways. But as I walked through the sunlit atrium, I realized the ultimate truth of my journey. My parents and my sister thought power was about dominating the people beneath you. They thought wealth gave them the right to be cruel. But they were wrong. True power is not about destroying the people who hurt you. It is about taking the broken, jagged pieces of your past and using them to build a shield for someone else. It is about having the strength, the grace, and the absolute defiance to remain kind in a world that tried so desperately to break you. The greatest lesson I learned is that true power does not come from destroying the people who hurt you, but from maintaining your integrity when the world expects you to be cruel. For years, I let my family's toxic expectations define my worth, believing their conditional love was all I deserved. But walking away from their betrayal taught me that setting firm boundaries is the ultimate act of self-respect. You do not need the approval of those who only value what they can exploit. Sometimes, losing toxic family members is exactly what you need to finally find your true self. If you have ever had to set firm boundaries with toxic family members to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below, and hit subscribe for more journeys of resilience and reclaiming your power.